The British Post Office was founded in 1660 by King Charles II during the Civil War, and to this day it remains strong, over the years providing a service to every member of the public in our day-to-day needs. But somehow it became the result of arguably the greatest travesty of justice in UK history. In 1996, the British Post Office conceived a new IT system provided by Fujitsu, known as Horizon, designed as a swipe card system for the payment of pensions and benefits from various post office branches across the country, though it didn't publicly get its launch until May of 1999. Private Eye would later publish an article, quote, when in May 1999 the plug was finally pulled on what the Commons Public Accounts Committee called one of the biggest IT failures in the public sector, taxpayers had lost around £700 million. Something had to be salvaged, however. So against the better judgment of its IT specialists, the Post Office decided to use the system to transform its paper-based branch accounting into an electronic system covering the full range of the Post Office services. The New Horizon project became the largest non-military IT contract in Europe. End quote. Within just weeks of Horizon's initial launch, several self-employed sub-postmasters who were under contract with the Post Office began reporting balancing errors via a helpline that they had been provided with. However, the Post Office themselves maintained that there was no computer error, and they blamed the sub-postmasters instead, even demanding that they pay back any financial shortfalls. Alex Hearn from the Guardian newspaper would later write, quote, a 1984 Act of Parliament ruled that computer evidence was only admissible if it could be shown that the computer was used and operating properly. But that act was repealed in 1999. Just months before the first trials of the Horizon system began. When post office operators were accused of stolen money, the hallucinatory evidence of the Horizon system was deemed sufficient proof. Without any evidence to the contrary, the defendants could not force the system to be tested in court, and their loss was all but guaranteed. End quote. It was in 2000 when 46-year-old sub-postmaster Alan Bates from Wales began to notice errors in the system when a bunch of his accounts were showing financial shortfalls. However, all of his concerns were completely ignored and his contract was terminated with the post office, supposedly as he refused to comply with their policies. In May 2002, 47-year-old sub-postmaster Anjana Sethi also raised her concerns with Horizon, leading to her contract being terminated as well. This led to her husband, 49-year-old shopkeeper Baljit, going to the press for the first time with the story. But in response, the post office denied that there was an issue with the system, claiming that they had sent experts to check it twice. It was only in 2004 when Alan Bates decided to not go down without a fight and went to Computer Weekly investigative journalist Tony Collins over suspicions about the Horizon system. He claimed that it took 5 years to act, as they only now felt like they could stand up the story. During his fight for justice, however, the issues only persisted, with 48-year-old Jo Hamilton, who ran the village post office in South Warnborough, Hampshire, and she too began to notice errors, as her accounts lost £36,000. The post office again maintained their trust in the Horizon system and actually prosecuted Hamilton for this, demanding that she pay back the lost finances. Hamilton felt like she had no choice but to plead guilty to false accounting in order to avoid prison time for theft, and she had to pay back the money. But the post office allegedly lied and claimed that she was the only person who was having issues with the system. It was that same year when 37-year-old Roderick Dundee faced the same fate and pleaded guilty to false accounting, being sentenced to over 240 hours of community punishment. In 2006, 59-year-old Noel Thomas, who had worked for Royal Mail for 42 years and ran a village post office in Wales, was convicted of false accounting, as Horizon showed his accounts losing £48,000. Noel spent 13 weeks in prison and was even disqualified as a local councillor. It only continued in December that same year, when 40-year-old sub-postmaster from Bridlington, Lee Castleton, followed the same fate, with Horizon showing that he lost the post office £25,859. But unlike the others, Castleton refused to pay it back. The post office sued him as Castleton represented himself in court and demanded compensation damages of £11,250. But sadly, the judge actually favoured the post office, believing that the financial deficiencies were real, claiming that Castleton didn't manage the business properly and that he had even breached his contract with them. Lee now not only owed the near £26,000 shortfall, but he also owed the losses and legal costs of a combined total of £321,000. Castleton was unfortunately unable to pay this back, and officially declared himself bankrupt. It was in 2009 when Alan Bates was finally able to continue his fight for justice, launching the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance, and Computer Weekly first officially broke their story about issues with the Horizon system. However, the post office still refused to acknowledge any faults with it, and maintained that the system was flawless. In 2010, 32-year-old Rubina Shaheen, who ran the Greenfields post office in Shrewsbury, similarly was prosecuted for a Horizon error showing £40,000 of losses in her accounts. She ended up spending 12 months in prison, and her husband lost their home and had to sleep in a van, being helped out by a local charity just to be able to survive. It was that same year when 34-year-old Seema Misra was convicted after Horizon incorrectly showed her accounts losing £70,000. And despite being pregnant at the time, she was sent to prison on the day of her son's birthday for 1 count of theft and 6 of false accounting. Barrister Paul Marshall would later state, quote, "On no less than 3 separate occasions, the defence applied to 3 separate judges to have the prosecution stopped on the basis that the disclosure given by the post office was woefully inadequate and the prosecution an abuse of process." End quote. The trial began in October, but just a few days prior, post office solicitors Rob Wilson, Jarnell Singh and Juliet McFarlane were all informed of further Horizon bugs, but none of them disclosed this information to Seema's defence team. These 3 would later be reported to the Solicitors Regulation Authority, and it turned out that they were part of a much bigger failure of disclosure on part of the post office, which cost Misra a fair trial. Barrister Warwick Tapford represented them that day, and he admitted that he felt ashamed to have been a part of the case due to the constant negligence that was going on. Criminal practitioner Keith Hadrill actually attempted to get this trial stopped, as Gareth Jenkins was called as an expert witness. Quote, "He operates under a restriction because he is an employee of Fujitsu who are under contract to the post office, and he can only comply with his contractual terms as best he can, and there is no suggestion his integrity is anywhere at fault as to what he is permitted to do, bearing in mind this is a post office prosecution. I don't go behind that, but it is not an independent prosecution at arm's reach from the loser company and Mr. Jenkins, so we have to have concerns as to the quality of his evidence and the best he has done in regard to the restrictions he operates under." End quote. To make matters worse, Gareth Jenkins was already under investigation with the Metropolitan Police on suspicion of possible perjury, and yet he was still called on as an expert witness. Regardless, Seema was sentenced to 15 months in prison, though she would only serve 4.5, constantly fearing that she was going to be stabbed in jail, having to give birth whilst wearing an electronic tag. She would later claim, quote, "It's hard to say, but I think that if I had not been pregnant, I would have killed myself." End quote. Despite the horrific nature of this case, it would later be revealed that Post Office Solicitor Jarnail Singh sent an email out to all post office managers celebrating the verdict. Quote, "It is to be hoped the case will set a marker to dissuade other defendants from jumping on the Horizon bashing bandwagon." End quote. That very same year, 49-year-old Peter Huxham was also charged and pleaded guilty to fraud by misrepresentation after Horizon showed a shortfall of £16,158. Huxham spent 8 months in prison, but to make matters worse, his marriage fell apart as his wife Jackie was convinced that he was guilty, as was his son Luke. After the divorce, Peter fell into a life of depression and alcoholism as he became estranged from his entire family. A later court investigation stated, quote, "It is not good enough to say the POL prosecution strategies were flawed and failed without also identifying the lines of accountability. After all, someone devised the strategy, someone signed it off, someone designed it, someone implemented it, and someone managed it. Others then endorsed it, defended it, and protected it. Those people need to account for their actions and justify what was done." End quote. Despite all of these issues at this point, senior post office management still refused to give Horizon an independent review, nor was it the subject of a full, rigorous system audit. The reason given was that if the system was being investigated, this would need to be disclosed in court, which would be a sign of the post office doubting their own system, and therefore leading to possible appeals for all past prosecutions and imprisonments caused by Horizon. However, the legal system would also require them to have some kind of computer evidence to confirm that they were managing the system responsibly, which was never given. At the time, there was a naive and simplistic understanding of software systems, so the popular presumption was merely that the computer evidence was correct. Systems of this size are incredibly complex, leading to those responsible being unable to discern whether or not they were actually reliable, or unable to spot any errors if these were possible to happen, no matter how simple they may be. Despite these ongoing problems, in 2011, 46-year-old sub-postmaster from Newcastle, Sarah Burgess Boyd, was prosecuted after being accused of causing a shortfall of money caused by Horizon. Despite being acquitted in court after the post office failed to provide any evidence against her, Sarah lost her entire life savings trying to pay them back, and admitted that she had lost everything, including her reputation. After so many cases, it finally led to members of Parliament issuing an investigation, appointing forensic accountants from the firm Second Sight, as well as the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance, to look into the cases with the Post Office and Horizon. Chair of Second Sight Ron Warmington claimed, quote, "Paid for by the Post Office, Second Sight agreed to investigate only if they convinced us that they were going to join forces in a search for the truth, not withhold papers and let us off the leash to do what we thought appropriate." End quote. It didn't take long for them to conclude that Horizon had suffered several accounting faults which caused financial discrepancies. But once again, the Post Office denied Horizon having any issues. It was in July 2013 when Second Sight issued an interim report where they acknowledged no evidence of system-wide problems with Horizon, but that there were 2 incidents where defects or bugs in the software had caused shortfalls in accounts at 76 different branches. But these had been identified by the Post Office, and the sub-postmasters had been cleared of any liability. But by this point, over 100 of them had either already been prosecuted or forced to pay back the lost money. Things would only get worse for them that same month when they received advice from barrister Simon Clark, representing the solicitors firm Cartwright King, who believed that the trials had all been misled regarding the true reliability of the Horizon system. He was fully convinced that Gareth Jenkins was completely aware of all of the bugs in the system, but still lied in court about its accuracy, convinced that there had been at least 26 potential miscarriages of justice in the past few years. In August, he also learned that the Post Office had received specific instructions to shred several minutes of a conference call regarding the bugs within Horizon, though this evidence wouldn't be published for nearly a decade. That very same month, the post office did set up a mediation scheme chaired by retired Judge Sir Anthony Hooper, but even he doubted that the sub-postmasters had been dishonest, and he fully believed that Horizon was at fault. By October, the BAE Systems Digital Intelligence System Dedica conducted their own analysis of the post office's systems and concluded that they were, quote, not for purpose in a modern retail and financial environment, end quote. It was in 2014 when 45-year-old Jackie L. Kazaby and her 48-year-old sister Rose Stewart, who ran a post office in Glasgow, were prosecuted for a £34,000 shortfall caused by Horizon. However, this case was actually rejected by the prosecutor, though the reason was never disclosed. But despite this verdict, the post office continued to demand that they pay back the $34,000. Jackie and Rose maintained their innocence, but they did agree to pay the post office £10,000 anyway. In September that year, an early draft of another Second Sight report was leaked to the BBC, in which they claimed that Horizon hadn't tracked money from lottery terminals, vehicle excise duty payments, or cash machine transactions. None of these were ever taken into account, and the post office just immediately accused the sub-postmasters of theft or false accounting without any evidence. The report also included issues with poor training, outdated equipment, and inadequate communications, but this was completely dismissed once again by the post office themselves. To make matters worse for them, auditors from Deloitte, a professional accounting services network, discovered that Fujitsu were actually able to remotely alter the branch accounts, leading to further investigations into Horizon and their entire history of transactions. By December, several MPs had become overly critical and concerned about the post office's mediation scheme due to the ongoing evidence, leading to 140 members of parliament withdrawing their support. James Arbuthnot led 144 MPs who had been contacted by sub-postmasters, accusing the organisation of rejecting around 90% of applications for mediation. In response, the post office claimed that these accusations were regrettable and surprising. But Arbuthnot maintained that the post office had been duplicitous and was convinced that this would lead to legal and political campaigns. In February the following year, Angela van den Bogen, who was the head of partnerships at the post office at the time, maintained that they had provided Second Sight with all of the information that they had agreed to prove at the outset, but this was disputed by Second Sight investigator Ian Henderson, who denied receiving any prosecution files, which were needed to investigate his suspicions that the post office had brought cases against sub-postmasters with, quote, inadequate investigation and inadequate evidence. End quote. He was even insistent that these files remained outstanding for 18 months after they were first requested. Strangely, it was at this point in March 2015 when Second Sight's contract was abruptly terminated, and the post office themselves never provided any evidence that their own internal auditors had actually conducted an appropriate system audit of their own. Just a month later, Second Sight issued another report, quote, for some sub-postmasters in some limited circumstances, Horizon could not be described as fit for purpose, end quote. MP Andrew Bridgen regarding this investigation would later claim, quote, I was in the original post office review group. By 2015, a whistleblower from Fujitsu had come forward from the boiler room, as they called it. He had been altering accounts without the knowledge of the sub-postmasters. The MPs in the review group knew. The investigator from Second Sight, Ron Warmington, knew. The post office knew that the convictions were unsafe, as did the government, yet it took another 5 years of very expensive litigation from the 555 before justice was done, end quote. It was that same year when Baroness Neville Rolfe, on the behalf of the government, demanded Post Office Chairman Tim Parker to review the Horizon situation and commissioned barrister Jonathan Swift to investigate. Swift and barrister Christopher Knight ended up writing a report, now known as the Swift Review, which wouldn't be released for another 6 years. The evidence-based Justice Lab Post Office Scandal Project at the University of Exeter stated, quote, the Swift Review revealed to the Post Office Chairman that secret access to Horizon was possible in 2016, end quote. The following year, Alan Bates continued his fight, leading 555 sub-postmasters to bring group action in the High Court against the Post Office. However, this case proved to be anything but simple, as in November that year, the post office applied to alter the timetable for the trials due to several delays and cost issues. The judge would later claim, quote, "Fitting hearings around their availability has all the disadvantages of doing an intricate jigsaw puzzle, with none of the fun associated with that activity," end quote. It was 2018, during Alan Bates and the sub-postmasters' legal battle with the post office, when the Horizon system was officially and legally declared as completely unreliable. Despite this, in October, the post office actually applied to strike out 1/4 of the lead evidence against them, an application that consisted of over 160 paragraphs. The judge, Justice Fraser, responded, quote, "The application by the defendant to strike out this evidence appears to be an attempt to hollow out the lead claimant's case to the very barest of bones, if not beyond, and to keep evidence with which the defendant does not agree from being aired at all," end quote. However, the court were convinced that this evidence was completely relevant and admissible, so this application was promptly dismissed. By March 2019, the contract disagreements between the sub-postmasters and the post office began to be investigated, finding 23 discrepancies, with the judge determined to resolve all of them. However, of those 23 issues, 16 of them were actually in the favour of the sub-postmasters. Despite this, the judge still criticised the testimonies provided by the post office witnesses. Quote, "Angelina van der Boga did not give me frank evidence and sought to obfuscate matters and mislead me. The post office appears, at least at times, to conduct itself as though it is answerable only to itself. The statement that is prepared to preserve documents as though that were a concession, and the obdurate to accept the relevance of plainly important documents and to refuse to produce them is extremely worrying," end quote. The main focus of the trial was Horizon's true functionality, and 29 bugs, errors and defects were quickly discovered and analysed, though the post office still maintained that the system was flawless. The post office's defence team even attempted to convince the judge to recuse himself from the trial, which would abstain him from participating. Journalist and writer Nick Wallace referred to this strategy as, quote, "a misuse of a very serious instrument designed to aid fairness as a weapon purely for their wealthy clients' benefit," end quote. Kathleen Donnelly, standing on the side of the sub-postmasters, claimed, quote, "It is obvious that the post office had a strategy to withhold material until they were forced to produce it. This caused delay, disruption and ran up costs. We only received documents after a battle and were left with little time to review them, sometimes just days before a witness was cross-examined. It was exasperating," end quote. An unnamed former post office manager would later admit that they knew it was ultimately a lost case, and this strategy was a way of killing off any challenges to the Horizon system. The Law Society Gazette wrote, quote, "In a scathing 17-page document, the Court of Appeal has thrown out an attempt by the Post Office to appeal a judge's refusal to recuse himself from group litigation on the grounds of bias. Ruling in Post Office Limited v. Alan Bates and Orrs, the Right Honourable Lord Justice Colson said that the recusal application never had any substance and was rightly rejected by the judge. He also expressed sympathy with the suspicion raised by the other party in the case, a group of sub-postmasters and mistresses, that the recusal application had been made in the hope that a sub-trial would collapse. Although I can reach no concluded view on the matter, I can at least understand why the sub-postmasters and mistresses submitted that was its purpose." End quote. The entire recusal application cost the Post Office over £212,000, which included £34,165 for solicitors and a further £175,815 for counsel. Furthermore, the judge also wasn't a fan of Stephen Parker, who was the head of the Post Office's recusal application supporting Fujitsu. Quote, "I did not consider that Mr. Parker was interested in accuracy in any of his evidential exercises. I do not consider his evidence in his witness statements to have been remotely accurate, even though he stoutly maintained that it was." End quote. The judge soon concluded that the contracts with the Post Office had been unfair, and that Horizon did in fact contain bugs, errors and defects. However, the case was eventually settled out of court for £58 million. However, the sub-postmasters had all been financed by a litigation fund known as Therium. Due to the obscenely high costs of the High Court legal battles, most of the aforementioned Horizon cases didn't even make it to court. The post office agreed to pay £58 million, but never admitted any liability for their mistakes, so no compensation could be awarded, and the government decided that they couldn't apply for it either. However, £46 million went to financial backers and to cover all of the court costs, leaving Bates and the 555 sub-postmasters with £12 million to share between them, which was around £21,000 each. Though the judge did allow them the opportunity to challenge all of their individual prosecutions in court. Barrister Paul Marshall, who represented the sub-postmasters, claimed, quote, "The post office knew that its evidence was unsatisfactory, but because it failed to comply with its duty to disclose documents, the fact that its evidence was flawed and unreliable was known to neither the defendant sub-postmasters nor to the court, and thus constituted no impediment to its securing convictions against its thereby disadvantaged sub-postmasters." End quote. By December, Ron Warmington stated, quote, "The post office has improperly enriched itself through the decades with funds that have passed through its own suspense accounts. Had its own staff more diligently investigated in order to establish who were the rightful owners of those funds, they would have returned to them, whether they were post office's customers or its sub-postmasters. When is the post office going to return the funds that in effect belonged to its sub-postmasters? It also seems clear that now some of those funds could have been generated by Horizon itself, or by errors made by the post office's own staff, or by those of Fujitsu. They weren't real losses at all. They were phantom discrepancies. If the post office board had believed and acted on what Second Sight reported, instead of being led by the nose by its own middle management and in-house and external legal advisors, huge amounts of money and human suffering would have been avoided." End quote. Speaking on behalf of the post office, Chief Executive Paula Venables said, quote, "I am truly sorry we were unable to find both a solution and a resolution outside of litigation and for the distress this caused. The message that the board and I were consistently given by Fujitsu from the highest levels of the company was that, like any IT system, Horizon was not perfect and had a limited lifespan. It was fundamentally sound. I raised this question of remote access repeatedly, both internally and with Fujitsu, and was always given the same answer, that it was not possible for branch records to be altered remotely without the sub-postmaster's knowledge. Indeed, I remember being told by Fujitsu's then CEO when I raised it with him that the system was like Fort Knox." End quote. The post office frequently denied receiving any complaints about issues with Horizon in the past. Despite this verdict, a minister stated, quote, "The settlement agreed in December was full and final. For this reason, it has been excluded from the scope of the inquiry. The post office is not currently conducting any private prosecutions and has no plans to do so. Only the courts can decide on criminal matters, such as whether to overturn the postmaster's convictions, so it would not be appropriate for the inquiry to look at these questions, especially when the court process is still going on." End quote. However, solicitors James Hartley and Neil Hudgell didn't believe that they had actually seen any fair settlement offers, claiming that 2,000 of the cases were settled without any legal advice being given, and insisting that this also needed to be investigated. Quote, "Now post office officials must face criminal investigation for maliciously ruining lives by prosecuting innocent people in pursuit of profits." End quote. Sadly, in 2020, Peter Huxham, who had lost his entire family due to the poor reputation and losses caused by Horizon, passed away from a believed suicide at the age of 63, having never resolved issues with his loved ones, who were all convinced that he was guilty. He never met his grandchildren and would never mend the broken bond with his wife or son. And tragically, this was only shortly before his name was finally going to be cleared, at which point his son decided to continue his application for justice on his behalf. Similarly, Roderick Dundee applied to join the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the CCRC, but would pass away not long after, leaving his daughter to continue fighting his case for him. It was that year when the government decided to establish their own independent inquiry, and justice was finally beginning to surface. James Arbuthnot would claim, quote, "My own suggestion is that the government should clear out the entirety of the board and senior management of the post office and start again, perhaps with the assistance of consultancy services from Second Sight who know where the bodies are buried." End quote. Although the Bates trial the previous year didn't go in the favour of the sub-postmasters, it did pave the way for those attempting to get their convictions overturned. By March 2020, the CCRC announced that they were referring 39 cases to be appealed on the grounds that their initial prosecutions had been an abusive process. By December, the first appeal began against the conviction, citing cases between 2004 and 2012. But surprisingly, not only did the post office not oppose this, but they even apologised for what they referred to as historical failings. The judge commented, quote, "I am sure that all of the appellants are grateful for the approach that the post office has taken finally to this matter, and that it can be put to rest for them." End quote. It was only now when Simon Clark's advice regarding the Horizon system from 7 years earlier was brought to the attention of the authorities, leading to Paul Marshall resigning from the case, fearing possible contempt of court proceedings, though this would later be lifted. The call for evidence soon began, with the trial starting the following month. But the Sub-Postmasters Alliance actually refused to take part, describing the whole thing as a complete whitewash, demanding a full public inquiry. As well as looking into the Horizon shortfall bugs in the system, Metropolitan Police were also investigating potential cases of perjury and perverting the course of justice during the post office investigations, leading to 2 former Fujitsu expert witnesses being extensively interviewed under caution. By 2021, the investigation became a statutory public inquiry. But on April the 8th, Post Office Chief Executive Nick Reed confirmed that a brand new computer system would finally replace Horizon and be, quote, more user-friendly and easier to adapt for new products and services to ensure easy maintenance and ready interoperability with other systems, end quote, even planning to share the profits with sub-postmasters. However, that same month, due to the ongoing appeals, 39 previously charged postmasters had their convictions completely quashed. By May, the Law Society Gazette reported that the post office hadn't been adequately resourced, as 200 Horizon convictions had been brought forward to review, and they all had to be investigated individually. However, Nick Reed asked the government for help, claiming, quote, "The post office simply does not have the financial resources to provide meaningful compensation," end quote. The government assured the public fair and fast payouts for the 555 victims who were previously excluded from the aforementioned compensation scheme. Despite their claims of financial peril, the CEO allegedly received a salary of £436,000 in 2022, with a bonus of £137,000. By July, the government announced that the sub-postmasters who had been wrongly convicted would be receiving an interim compensation of up to £100,000. Once Rabina Shaheen's conviction was overturned, she actually used her compensation money to donate to the charity that had helped her and her husband during their time of homelessness and desperation. In February 2022, the government began to express concerns over the sheer amount of time it was taking to offer out settlements to the wrongfully convicted and to provide compensation, assuring the post office that this was an urgent issue, as many of those affected were elderly or at risk of losing their homes, with some even passing away waiting for justice. On March the 22nd, the government launched a scheme to compensate 555 of the sub-postmasters at the same compensation level as those whose convictions were overturned. But by December, Tim Maloney KC claimed that some of them were actually made bankrupt after only receiving a fraction of what they were due to be paid, while an unnamed sub-postmaster, whose liability had been completely cleared, told the BBC, quote, "I want someone else to be charged and jailed like I was," end quote. By March 2023, 27 of those who qualified for the group litigation scheme had since passed away without ever receiving compensation. And that same month, Paul Marshall criticised the entire scheme. Under English company law, it's required that the board of a company must act in the best interest of its shareholders. So he felt like the post office were bound to act in the interest of the government to keep compensation as low as possible, stating, quote, "There should be independence at the point where an applicant for compensation engages, not once there is an issue. Compensation paid will tend to be skewed in favour of the post office / the government. The scheme for those with overturned convictions is not compensation, but is the continuation of litigation. The most grievously harmed victims of the post office remain locked in adversarial litigation. Those who do not have convictions become engaged in a quasi-inquisitorial process," end quote. In September, solicitor Stephen Dilley, who represented the post office in the trial against Lee Castleton, admitted that they were fully aware that he wouldn't be able to pay the bill if he lost, but they just wanted to send a message that they would continue to defend Horizon. By January 2024, the government announced plans for a blanket exoneration, with the wrongfully convicted becoming eligible for compensation from the post office directly, as well as over 2,750 sub-postmasters who had been severely financially affected but not charged. A television drama soon aired on ITV which brought the case to the mainstream media and became a huge news story. The post office ended up paying out £153 million to claimants, and around 64% of those affected had now received full and final compensation. But things weren't going to get any better for the post office. On January the 12th, 2024, BBC business editor Simon Jack reported that the post office had also underpaid over £100 million in tax by deducting it from the compensation payments to the victims of the Horizon scandal. Tax expert Dan Needle claimed that tax relief for compensation paid to victims could actually be illegal, and it means that the business itself could be at risk of complete insolvency, and that senior executives may have also been overpaid in their salaries. The BBC claimed that the HMRC could be investigating the way that the post office had accounted for the compensation payments, as tax consultant Heather Self stated, quote, "The payments of compensation by the post office are almost certainly not deductible for corporation tax purposes in my view," end quote. She maintained that the post office just didn't have the funds to pay a £100 million tax bill. On January the 27th, Post Office Chairman Henry Staunton was dismissed, though it was allegedly about more than just the ongoing Horizon scandal. That same month, reports were discovered showing that the Post Office actually attempted to terminate their contract with Second Sight around the time they were publishing their reports about the Horizon system. Regarding the post office's ongoing investigation, James Arbuthnot claimed, quote, "Since those cases were referred to the Court of Appeal, things have come out within the public inquiry about the investigators' behaviour and about the post office's entire approach to the ethics of prosecution, which I believe take us way beyond the application of Horizon data." End quote. The families of 60 people who had passed away before receiving any compensation were allowed to apply in their place. By February, 100 sub-postmasters' convictions had been overturned in court, and it was reported that the government were meeting with representatives of the post office operators to possibly discuss handing them over complete ownership of the organisation. By February, around 4,000 sub-postmasters were eligible for compensation. This led to further investigations on a similar system known as capture, which was used throughout the 1990s in around 300 post offices around the country and faced similar errors. 236 sub-postmasters had gone to prison, whereas the post office had prosecuted around 700 due to Horizon. MP Kevin Jones actually wrote to a post office minister regarding capture and its faults, and would state, quote, "We know that the capture software was faulty, resulting in corrupted data. We also know that the post office knew about these faults at the time, as it openly communicated with sub-postmasters about them." If there are to be overturned convictions, they cannot just be about Horizon. They should also be about capture. Evidence that I have put to the public inquiry and sent to the minister yesterday clearly indicates that the scandal predates Horizon. Those affected need to be included in both the compensation scheme and among those with overturned convictions. End quote. The post office themselves refused to comment or answer any detailed question about the capture system. On March the 13th, Parliament introduced the Post Office Horizon System Offences Bill, which provides provision to quash any Horizon-related convictions of sub-postmasters in England and Wales who face prosecution, including the deceased. The government had set aside £1 billion for compensation, though they fully expected to exceed that number. Shockingly, the post office was still adamant that some postmasters were actually guilty of criminal wrongdoing and subject to prosecution. Post Office Minister Kevin Hollinrake stated that those claiming compensation would need to sign a statement of truth to confirm that they were completely innocent. Quote, "Anyone subsequently found to have signed such a statement untruthfully will be putting themselves at risk of prosecution or fraud." End quote. This act was heavily criticised by the BBC, calling it unprecedented and unpractical, making it extremely difficult to actually implement, which was reiterated by MP David Davis, who claimed that this would fail to distinguish between the genuinely innocent majority and the actually guilty minority. Barrister Sam Fowles claimed, quote, "The government could give the Commission and the courts the resources to investigate outstanding wrongful convictions, but this would risk exposing more post office wrongdoing and or highlight the long-term flaws in the justice system that allowed false prosecutions to go on for so long." End quote. It's estimated that there were 700 post office workers prosecuted across England and Wales, but 250 have yet to come forward to claim any compensation, despite efforts by the CCRC and the post office themselves. The Law Society Gazette wrote, quote, "Maloney explained an applicant had run a successful postmaster business for 20 years before his life was ruined by a false conviction, which led to his mental health deteriorating, and him being unable to pay his mortgage. In another case, a victim's award of £25,000 was reduced to £4,500, after deductions paid to the official receiver." The barrister added, "It appears that the shortfall scheme takes no account of whether the root cause of the bankruptcy was or may have been generated by the Horizon software. Compensation is intended to put the claimant in the position they would have been if they had not been adversely affected. Many of the debts accrued by these people which led to bankruptcy were caused by the shortfalls. The compensation award is then swallowed up by legal obligations to repay debts." End quote. This investigation is still ongoing as hundreds continue to search for justice. But director Simon Rickaldin, who is responsible for the compensation and disclosures, believes that all of the settlements will be made by March 2025. Prime Minister Boris Johnson was determined to get to the bottom of it, stating, quote, "We must stand with postmasters to get to the bottom of what went wrong in the Post Office Horizon IT dispute. I heard firsthand the irreparable impact it has had on their lives. That's why, in light of the recent Court of Appeal judgment, we're stepping up our independent inquiry by putting it on a statutory footing so we can get the answers they deserve."